Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our next virtual event. We're having an emergency virtual event that we put together today, just in light of how things are dynamically changing so quickly in the cannabis space. For those of you who aren't familiar, and there's certainly a lot of people that haven't seen much of this, there's also a lot that's been very dynamically shifting incredibly quickly on the hemp side of the industry behind the scenes. And now these are going to be converging as we see the DEA rescheduling. And so there's been a lot of question like, what does this mean? And so we put together this emergency event. We brought in some top people in the industry. Because we've only had less than a week to plan this, we've got a couple people that are in travel or in motion that will be jumping in here soon. And so we're going to go ahead and get started because we have so much to cover today. And then we'll see a couple people here join the call shortly. But would like to go ahead and get us started and first say thank you so much for taking some time to join us. Thank you for the opportunity to share some insights with you. The Cannabis Chamber is a nonprofit national trade association built with just the purpose of helping serve the broader cannabis industry and the businesses in the cannabis industry. We're really just a bunch of leaders in the industry that have come together to say, hey, how can we give back and how can we help support the businesses in the industry? As good stewards of the industry, and are here to really help you with your needs through networking events, through good information, and through other things. And so our virtual events are just one of the ways that we help support the industry. We have regional teams on the ground across 11 states, and we have some great members from our different teams at some very big firms, some which are global, some which are very big national firms, some which are more regional boutique firms. And then we've got Hirsch, who's got a fantastic national consulting firm. And so we'll go ahead and take a minute and let's move around the room, introduce everybody. Hirsch, would you like to go first since we were just mentioning it?
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris. Hey, everyone. Great to be here with you today. My name is Hirsch Jain, and I run a strategy consulting firm called Ananda Strategy, which represents operators across the supply chain in the United States, Canada, and Western Europe. I'm also on the board of directors of CalNormal, which has been one of the longstanding cannabis rights organizations based in California, and I'm the vice chair of the Cannabis Chamber of Commerce. So great to be here.
Thank you, Hirsch. And Hirsch is always so humble, but Hirsch is well regarded, speaks on a number of circuits. We're very honored to have him here today. In that same vein, we've got Michael Schwang. Mike, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, great. Thanks. And echoing Hirsch's comments, great to be here. Hope we can add a little bit of knowledge to everybody on the call. So I am a corporate transactional lawyer at Duane Morris, based in the New York office. We were the first national law firm to enter the cannabis sector probably 8 or 9 years ago. My practice is focused, mainly on corporate matters, everywhere from helping, form and do governance for newly licensed entities through M&A and other capital raising events. And I also, work, probably a third of my practice is with plant touching entities across the supply chain. A third is with capital sources, and the third is with ancillary businesses. And as a firm, we have 120 lawyers in our cannabis practice, working in all aspects of legal disciplines that all businesses face. And I am the current chair of the tri-state chapter, being New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, or Pennsylvania, depending on which part of the tri-state you're in. And so if any of those of you on the call who are not yet part of the tri-state group, love to have you join us. And we're expecting to arrange an in-person event later this month.
Yes. For those of you who are in some of the states that we are in across the nation, we're launching monthly recurring networking events across 6 states this month. We just had a really fantastic event in Colorado where we had about 100 different attendees for our first event. These are a little bit smaller, more intimate events, but they are going to be recurring on a monthly basis. And so we're having a few across different regions in California, Colorado, Illinois, the tri-state area, the DMV market. So please join us at one of the events if you have the opportunity. And Let's go ahead and jump in. So let's go ahead and start. I think one of the top things on everybody's mind is, okay, so we're seeing the DEA reschedule this. What is this federal process for legalization? How long will it take, for this rescheduling to be figured out and finalized in terms of kind of the first piece of this? And, I don't know which one of you two wants to jump in first.
I'm happy to take a first crack at it on the timing question. And one caveat I'll offer before we walk through the timing and the mechanics of next steps is this is truly an unprecedented process. And so I think you're likely to hear speculation on what might happen, and people will come out with different opinions, many of them educated. But really, we're in unprecedented territory here, and very informed people have different perspectives on how this might play out. With that caveat aside, to answer your question on timing, Chris, as we all know, last week we got a leak that the DEA agreed with the recommendation from the Department of Health and Human Services to move cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. The rule is not yet finalized, so here's what has to happen going forward. First, the DEA's perspective has been relayed to the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, which is a federal agency, and what they will do is they will help put together a proposed rule. After that, there is a notice and comment process. And, this is pretty standard whenever a federal regulation is proposed. A regulation is put out, and then members of the public have the opportunity to provide comments on that proposed rule and, modifications they might like to see. Calling that out here because, once that is sort of published in the Federal Register, all of you will have the opportunity to provide comment. Most people think that there will be a 60 or 90-day public comment period. After that, the DEA will sort of review those comments and publish a final rule. So if you do the math a little bit, right, we're here talking in May. Many people, based on that timeline, have speculated that we could see a final rule, say in September or October. Now, I'll offer a few caveats to that timing in a second, but that's what many people have speculated. Now, a couple other things that I'll note. The reason why many people believe a September or October timeline is feasible or realistic is that they view the Biden administration as wanting to codify these changes going into this presidential election. And, for reasons that we can unpack during this webinar, many people believe that this move was made with, sort of clear political strategy in mind to galvanize young voters. So again, that's all a way of saying those are the mechanics that have to play out procedurally, and that might lead to a September or an October timeframe. And again, many people believe that one of the ways that the Biden administration can campaign on this issue is if this rule is codified by then. But with that being said, I just want to say again that nobody really knows, right? It is possible that this rule is subject to judicial challenges. And, there are many groups, I think Smart Approaches to Marijuana or SAM have signaled their intention to challenge this rule. So it very well could be possible that, this rule is further delayed beyond September or October because of those challenges. And, perhaps the final thing I'll say, and then I'll pause because we could unpack this for a long time. As we think about, potential judicial challenges to this ruling, I think it makes clear why this process was done so deliberately, right? So the Biden administration in October of 2022 announced this rescheduling review. It was another 9 months before the Department of Health and Human Services, put forth its recommendation, another 8 months before the DEA agreed. And so that's all a way of saying this review has proceeded according to the methodical operation of government and state agencies, and that's the kind of process that would help immunize this kind of a ruling from potential judicial challenges. So there's a lot of detail there. I'll just kind of conclude by saying if I was a betting man and they were like, hey, when do you think this will be finalized? I would pick something like October for the reasons I mentioned. But I want to acknowledge that there are plenty of people who believe this could take a year or 2 years. And, there's some set evidence to support that hypothesis, even if I don't agree with it.
So just to weigh in a couple of things, and 100% agree with the timeline that Hirsch has laid out. My understanding is, the head of the DEA did tip her hand slightly when she was testifying in Congress earlier this week to indicate, right, because the first step is she has to approve it and then, send it forth for publication as a proposed rule. She made some comment about and then, and then, when it comes out for public comment, which does indicate that it is working working its way through from the staff level up to her to publish final proposed rules. On the timeline side, I think, what's important to note is, as Hirsch mentioned, there are groups there that, will be able to make, to comment on the proposed rules. I think a lot of people fully expect that there will be, comments. The question then becomes, based on the comments and the degree to which, DEA follows, proper administrative procedure, addresses and considers rules, right? There can be, I guess the step to challenge it would be to file with an administrative law judge. And that's sort of the wild card, right? If it gets filed, with them, and there has to be a hearing before final rules come out, that's what I think could delay the process. And that's why people, have said, this could be a 1 to 3 year process. But we are, as Hirsch noted, in really uncharted territory. The other wild card is, when this happens, and if, as someone said on a panel on the same topic as to this yesterday, right? If this rolls into next year and there is a change in administration, is there the ability to for them to undo all this? Again, uncharted territory. It's never been done that way before, but there is nothing to prevent putting the brakes on the rescheduling process if it's not yet complete and a new administration wants to dial back up. So we're all sort of speculating with our the best crystal balls we have, and are all hopeful that it goes quickly and speedily and it gets done before November. But you're betting, right? There's no guaranteed path there.
And I agree with everything that Michael said. And just to add one quick comment on his last comment there regarding a change of administration, I think that's a really important point. I think we are going to see a lot of speculation in the coming months, as we engage in this presidential election about, what a potential Trump administration would mean for, for this rule, especially if it drags on. And look, I can't pretend to get inside Donald Trump's head. I don't think anyone really can, but I will just point out, I think the reason why it is critical at the state level to get more states, particularly red states, to legalize adult use cannabis is that it immunizes this potential change from blowback in a future administration. And so, many people may be aware that Ohio, a deep red state, is likely to start adult use sales next month. Florida, another big red state, will be on the ballot in November 2024. There could be a couple other red states, South Dakota and North Dakota, also on the ballot. And so I know we're here today to talk about the federal conversation, but I think the way in which we see sustained progress at the federal level, even if there's a change in administration, is by, enlisting more conservative states in this country into that adult use cannabis coalition. And so it's important to think about how these federal and state chess pieces dovetail with one another.
Thank you both. Thank you both. Okay, so I think a question on a lot of people's minds is, okay, once this does get codified, what's next? Do regulations need to be crafted around this? Does the federal government look at tax structures? And if so, how do those things work? And I know, again, to both your points, really new territory here, not really precedents for this, unless you go back 100 years to prohibition. But a best guess on what that looks like, or what are your guys' thoughts on how that might look, and what might shake out from that?
Go ahead, Hirsch. You can go first again.
Sure. I think my answer here is going to be pretty straightforward. I think of this in two buckets. There are, what are the automatic, kind of mechanical changes that will occur as a result of rescheduling? And then, what are sort of the more attenuated impacts of it? And so when I think about what are the automatic changes that would happen as a result of a move to Schedule 3, I think of two things primarily, and that's taxes and research. And so you've probably heard many times before how the 280E penalty does not apply to Schedule 3 controlled substances. So when this rule is finalized, 280E would be eliminated. I think it's also important to note that, So that could occur, but at the same time, there are many other efforts going on right now to push back against 280E. Many people may be aware that some of the largest public operators are not paying their 280E taxes, which is a new, sort of posture they've taken this year. There's also a case in federal court that will take a long time to play out, in which David Boies, a really famous attorney, is representing the cannabis industry, arguing that prohibition is unconstitutional. So that's all a way of saying one of the biggest impacts of rescheduling would be an elimination of 280E. And there are also other efforts at the judicial and legislative level to push back against that very onerous tax penalty. And then I think the second main impact here would be research. That doesn't change things overnight, but a lot of cannabis reform, its progress has been stalled because of our inability to research it. Researching a Schedule 3 substance is much easier than a Schedule 1. So those are the two things that I see as the automatic, downstream impacts. I'll also just say, I think there are a number of things that could happen in the medium term as a result of rescheduling, which is a way of saying, there are a bunch of entities, whether they be banks, whether they be insurance companies, whether they be stock exchanges, that have a lot of discretion on whether to work with cannabis businesses. And right now, very few banks work with cannabis businesses. Very few insurance companies cover cannabis. Major stock exchanges don't list cannabis businesses. And that wouldn't change overnight in a Schedule 3 world, but it's my belief that, Schedule 3 would send a normative signal to these institutions that cannabis is, although still illegal, a little bit less illegal than it was before. And it will give some of these banks and insurance companies and stock exchanges, it will give their legal departments more comfort in potentially engaging with cannabis businesses. And so I think it's important to note that aside from the immediate impacts, there are other ways in which Schedule 3 could help normalize cannabis in those ways.
Right. And I agree, but I think that, it's clear that the research and tax relief goes away. When people, make some comment, about, why are we giving tax relief to cannabis businesses? I think you have to turn it around the other way, right? At the moment, they've been singled out, and what rescheduling does is allow them to be taxed like any other, business out there, which will help, both small and large businesses alike. I've had a number of conversations with, my clients and contacts in the space over the past week, in terms of, what will this do for banking, lending, investment, you name it. And as Hirsch said, it's sort of, it's tipping the scales in the right direction. There's nothing, there's nothing that one can point a finger to at the moment to say, yes, this makes it 100% legal, and it's off to the races. It's still a Schedule 3 drug, which technically means you would need a medical prescription from a doctor to purchase the product. I don't think anybody believes this is going to cause the industry to take a step back and completely divide it into a fully legal, 100% medical, market where you walk into a dispensary, which will be medical only, with a doctor's note, so to speak. And states and the federal government will clamp down on adult use market by saying, well, it's now even more illegal than it was before. Right? I mean, this is viewed as a step in the right direction to make cannabis more acceptable to everybody. It's just a question of those folks who are sitting on the sidelines, where, is this enough movement to have them be more comfortable to join the industry?
And
awesome.
I'll just to add on that quickly, I think one of the exciting things about this tax change is it dramatically increases the number of business models that are feasible and economically viable, right, in the U.S. cannabis market. Also in certain states, right? So if I take my home state of California, and I see in the audience here we have some esteemed members of the assembly on this webinar, right? So if I think about my home state of California, which I love, it's been incredibly difficult to build a profitable cannabis business in California because you have the federal tax burden and then one of the highest state tax burdens in the country. And so, the universe of business models that are feasible in California is actually quite limited. It's operating retail stores in limited license markets or being fully vertically integrated. But as a result of this change, the universe of business models that are feasible, especially in a high tax market like California, where you've had both hands tied behind your back, that increases significantly. And that in turn, creates a more diverse market that serves consumers better. And so I think that's one of the really exciting things about this tax change is that in many of our high tax states, the cannabis business is potentially feasible again, where thus far, it's been very difficult to build a sustainable cannabis business.
Awesome. And I want to welcome Mike Gorell to the call. Mike, if you want to please introduce yourself, we're really happy to have you here.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Sorry for the technical issues of joining earlier, but yes, I'm Mike Gorell. I'm the partner in charge of Emeregency's cannabis practice.
For those of you who don't know, Armanino is a leading cannabis and consulting firm that's a global firm, and Mike's got some great reach and some fantastic insights. So thank you for joining. I don't know if you have anything that you wanted to add. We were talking about, we'd open it up with, what does this legal process look like? How long will it take to be rescheduled? We kind of went through that, and we were just moving on to, what are the implications here as they look to create new regulations and tax structures?
Yeah, and I think Michael touched on this briefly about the dichotomy between the medical and the adult use market, and I think it's important to note that I don't think we really have to worry about a CVS or other pharmacy getting into the cannabis business per se, because even if they were allowed to, dispense cannabis products, they would have to obtain their cannabis products from an FDA, DEA regulated entity. And so there's not going to be those entities. And I don't think cannabis companies are going to go out and now further, complicate their lives by getting DEA and FDA registrations on top of all the other regulatory matters that they have to deal with right now.
Yeah, and sort of on that point, and with the caveat that I'm not an FDA lawyer, so I may be making stuff up as I speak. But right, for them to start selling, those products, right, they would have to be, right. I mean, doctor prescribing cannabis for XYZ ailment, right? To actually say that, cannabis, helps to solve this, you'd have to go through an FDA regulatory process. And, I don't know that anybody at this point, until we get a whole lot more research, is going to, it's going to go down that route. I mean, you sort of look at the CBD world, right? Epidiolex is still the only, approved, product with CBD for a specific indication. That's worked its way through that process. So I agree. I think we stay, in the format we are now with dispensaries and state regulatory schemes, for quite some time.
Yeah, and I'm just going to be working to keep everybody on track because I know we got a lot of ground to cover today. So a couple of quick points I did want to jump in with, and then we'll move to the next point. So one, Hirsch had mentioned banking and some of the ancillary infrastructure pieces needed to build and run a cannabis business. Having had licenses in 4 states myself, I understand some of these constraints. And everybody had some great points. I wanted to add a little color. I'm certainly not as technically proficient or knowledgeable in some of the categories of these gentlemen, but from kind of a higher level overview, I haven't come from a corporate banking background myself. I know from a practical perspective, banks are very excited about getting into cannabis and other industries just because of the cash and revenue opportunities for them. And so there's merchant services, there's these other businesses, and like, what are the implications there? There's complex legal and regulatory things that need to go through. They're certainly, the gentleman here is certainly better to speak to those than me, but I can tell you from a practical perspective, there's a lot of big businesses that are very excited to jump in as soon as they can. So having those services available, banking, credit card processing, merchant services, treasury management, those things will happen very quickly once the regulatory infrastructure is there. And they're already happening in the hemp side of the industry. As far as
Chris, I would want to point out that,
yeah,
we also thought the same thing would happen to hemp companies once the Farm Bill was passed in 2018, and they still are having trouble, even though it's federally legal. There should be no problems, with them being able to, conduct their business like any other business, and yet they still are having problems with banking accounts and credit card processing and whatnot. So
and that's a great point, Mike. But there's a couple interesting points. One, in some cannabis businesses I have, we actually do have fully compliant, fully acknowledged banking and merchant services approved. So we were able. There are some banks doing it. We're working with a big national bank. I think the biggest, having come from banking and having come from a high level in administration at a big bank, I can tell you the biggest banks are under such intense regulatory scrutiny. And then there's the optics of like they're investors, and then there's this very weird so you can sell cannabis, but then you can't sell cannabis. So cannabis is federally legal, but cannabis is federally illegal. And so I think the biggest banks have said, look, it's just too confusing. We're getting too much pressure from the Fed. Like we're not going to participate in this yet. But I think this does open up that opportunity. As far as the state medical laws, we're going to talk about that next and get into that a little bit. But I think, as a concept, as we open that up, one thing to consider is not from the complex perspective, but more just a high level. There's, I believe Hirsch said it's 25. I think Hirsch said in a call that I had with him recently, we're potentially going to see 27, 28 states recreationally legal after the election. There's potential for that. And these are states that have said, okay, the federal government says these are the rules, very clear. We don't care. We're doing this anyway. And so I think in the face of that, the federal government's going to have to consider as they look at new regulations that these states were doing their own thing anyway. And so I think that's going to help shape kind of the accommodation, how that looks. But let's talk about that. Let's talk about, so how does this impact the current medical and recreational states in those laws? Or how do you gentlemen view that?
Well, I don't think it's going to really change too much because, as we were talking about it before, I don't think the regular pharmacies down the street are going to get into the dispensary business. And, I think medical cannabis patients are still going to go to the dispensaries they've been going to before. They still get a discount from, like, say, the sales tax or something because they have a medical card versus someone that is just buying it for adult use. So I think those advantages and things will remain in place.
I don't know that it opens up the door for interstate commerce, right? Which then really changes, which really changes the business model, right? I mean, now you have to figure out ways, to have your product sold in a state where you don't, have manufacturing capabilities, and really no one wants to have manufacturing capabilities in every single state. So, that doesn't really change, certainly on the adult use side. And probably not on the medical side either, given, how these are being sold.
And, I agree with what these gentlemen have said. I mean, just to add a few quick comments. First, Chris, you were mentioning the number of adult use states. So there's 24 adult use states today. I see a path potentially to getting to 28 by the end of the year. And just to kind of tick through them, in New Hampshire, they're currently in the late stages of an adult use debate. We should find out in a month or so whether that bill passes. And we have potentially up to 3 ballot initiatives for adult use on the November 2024 ballot. So that would be Florida, the one that folks are talking about a lot, and also South Dakota and North Dakota. I point that out because I see all of this federal action as downstream of that state action. I think the analogy I like to think about here is gay marriage, right? So for a period of a decade, state after state legalized gay marriage. Eventually, President Obama had to weigh in. Eventually, the Supreme Court, had to make a decision. So I see all of this federal action as downstream of state adult use action. And to answer your question about, how this might impact, recreational and medical states, I agree with everything that's been said. I think, one thing maybe that I'll just add is, especially in these recreational states, I think it can make these ecosystems healthier. Now, what I mean by that is, with the 280E tax repeal, the businesses will be healthier, but also I think we can imagine that some of those tax benefits will flow to the consumer. As we've seen in some states, often when you cut taxes, that the benefits of that flow to the consumer. And so that can help these legal markets be more competitive with illegal markets that exist out there. And I also think some of these economics will flow to employees, right? The cannabis industry has a very difficult time with retaining many employees. A lot of the unionization efforts we've seen in cannabis are sort of a function of the dissatisfaction that many employees have with these businesses. And so I think all of those constituents, the companies, consumers, and employees could benefit from this tax change. And so that even though that isn't a regulatory change, I think that'll change the character of these markets. And finally, on the medical side, I'll just say, one of the, I think, powerful things about the HHS report is that it lends more credence to these medical debates that are happening in states that aren't ready for adult use, right? So for instance, this November, Arkansas could have a ballot measure dramatically expanding its medical program, right? Eliminating qualifying conditions and, making renewal much easier. Mississippi, another conservative state, could similarly pass, a robust medical expansion. And so even in these conservative states that are not yet ready for adult use, the HHS report lends more credence to the concept that cannabis is medicine and can be effective there. And, the final comment I'll make, we were talking about pharmacies. I agree that you probably won't see much cannabis in pharmacies. The one exception to that may be the state of Georgia that initially had a plan to, sell medical cannabis oil in its regular pharmacies, which I think is incredibly exciting because it would expand access. They were kind of pushed back by the DEA last year, but now there's renewed optimism that we could see, medical cannabis oil, not flower, but oil in some of these pharmacies, which I think further, enhances the stature of cannabis as medicine rather than a vice.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so moving on, I think this parlays well into, so Mike Corral a minute ago was talking about how we probably won't see CVS or some of these stores carrying cannabis, but what we are seeing in a very interesting way is the Farm Bill has created a structure that has allowed hemp grown products to flourish in a surprising way. And now there are some not only major alcohol distributors, many throughout the Midwest, the South, and some along the East Coast that have gotten into cannabis and are distributing cannabis in a big way. But now we're also starting to see some major big box retailers. Total Wine, most notably, is carrying cannabis products unabashedly. Like, they're proud to advertise. They have big end caps with nothing but cannabis drinks as you walk into the store. It's become a surprisingly big part of their business model very quickly. And I've been told that Total Wine even sent a letter to the AG of California saying, hey, we would like to start carrying cannabis drinks in our store in California, which was very interesting to me because they're kind of usurping then the whole regulatory process in California. I've only heard that anecdotally, so I don't know that that's accurate, but what is interesting is that under the hemp law guidelines, CVS could carry these products. Now, whether or not as a business model they think that's the right fit for them, I'm not sure. To Mike's point, maybe it's not. But we are seeing this flourish. And so how do hemp products and this whole Farm Bill and all of this fit into, in your guys' thoughts, fit into how we see this evolve over the next couple of years and how we see these regulations kind of congeal? Do we see something that looks a little bit more structured as like kind of one set of laws and regulations? Do we see kind of these two paths still? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I've heard countless different views on this. One on one end of the spectrum, I've heard people say, we're going to essentially have a, high THC concentration medical market, and all dispensaries will effectively be medical, and then you'll have, low dose hemp derived, products that you can buy and sell everywhere and ship everywhere. I mean, if you look at, there are now, several major brands out there that have switched to, hemp derived THC, and right, THC is THC, no matter what it comes from. Obviously, I think it's, it's slightly more expensive to extract it from a hemp plant. But if it allows you to ship everywhere, there, by my count, there are at least 4 major brands that are doing that. I have heard other folks say, and who are lobbying, that this loophole should be closed, and right, if it's an intoxicating cannabinoid, it should be regulated like all other cannabinoids. Now, what I understand, there is nothing new in the proposed 2024 Farm Bill. So if that passes as is, we will continue with this current market. I do think people in the industry, want some level of regulation of hemp-derived cannabinoids so that we don't have a situation where there's adulterated, dangerous product out there in the market. Because frankly, anybody could, get a hemp license, grow hemp, it's untested, unregulated, which is not good for the industry. So whether it's industry self-regulation or state or federally imposed regulation, we may get there, which would then shift the models yet once again. But I think it's like everything else here, we're speculating.
I agree with Michael, but I do think that there needs to be some form of regulation, and it just can't be completely wild west, because it's just dangerous for the public, to be ingesting products that haven't been tested, and you just don't know what you're really taking, and dosages could be way off what the package says it is, and so I think that there needs to be some sort of uniform guideline, and it would be great if we could have cannabis and hemp all combined under one set of rules, so that everyone knows when you're in the hemp space, this is what you have to do. In cannabis space, this is what you have to do. But I don't know if we'll ever get that.
Well, and I think to your point, not only the guideline or some kind of regulatory framework important, but there's been a number of lawsuits. And I think for those of you who might have seen, there was a massive lawsuit filed against both Steezy and Cookies for, some of the, alleged issues with their products in the hemp space. And so, having that framework, I think, and some kind of regulatory oversight is important. What that looks like, hopefully without metric and some of the other complexities that can end up being heavy burdens on operators. But Hirsch, I'm sure you got some.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a big topic. I feel like we could spend a whole webinar talking about this. I'll just share some quick thoughts. I mean, first, I think public health has been mentioned. I think all of us, regardless of where we're situated, public health should be the driving principle as we think about how to regulate these products. And we should remember that progress on drug policy reform is not linear. We have seen in places like Thailand and places like Oregon, maybe even places like New York, that if a program is not rolled out the right way, it can invite a backlash. And as we seek to normalize this plant, we should think about how we do it in a way that does not invite backlash because of public health challenges. So just as a principle, I think that should guide our regulatory approach. I think, the proliferation of these hemp products, regardless of how you feel about them, shows the persistent demand that the American people have for cannabis products, right? The fact that these are so widely available indicates the immense consumer interest that exists in this category. And so that should hearten all of us, right, who work in this space. I also think it's interesting to unpack it by category type, right, or form factor. And, we probably don't have time to fully go into it on this webinar, but I think beverage is amongst the most interesting of these form factors, just because it's so familiar to people, and the proliferation of these beverage products in places like Minnesota and their adoption really is fascinating. And there's a strong public health rationale for using it as a substitute for alcohol. So I think that's interesting. And maybe just a couple more things I'll say, because again, I feel like we could talk about this for a while. I think the elimination of 280E is critical to enabling, the quote unquote marijuana and the quote unquote hemp intoxicant, sectors from playing nice, with one another. As was alluded to before, this is one plant, and the distinctions that we've made between hemp and, psychoactive marijuana really are artificial, right? Is it 0.3%? Is it 1%? These all kind of lack scientific foundation. And, we don't want ourselves to be consumed by a civil war. And I think, establishing some tax parity via 280E is a critical step into treating this as one plant. And, maybe a couple other things I'll say. Regardless of what happens with the Farm Bill and at the federal level, we have seen that there are, regulations at the state level that are unfolding in all of these different ways, right? There are states like Connecticut who are placing restrictions on these beverages that are sort of the opposite of Minnesota, where these beverages can flourish. And so anyone who is operating in that space, federal law aside, needs to be attentive to, I think, the state dynamics. It's kind of like, what we've been experiencing over the past 15 years in cannabis, but on steroids, right? The sort of the speed with which different regulatory approaches are taken. And so I think we need to be mindful of that. And, finally, perhaps I'll say one of the great benefits, I think, of the spread of these hemp intoxicant products is they kind of visually illustrate how prohibition doesn't work, right? In places like Virginia and places like Texas, the lack of a cannabis ecosystem has led these products to really explode. And I think the quote unquote cannabis industry should use that, right, as an argument in illustrating why prohibitionist policies don't work. So no really clear thoughts on a regulatory framework, but I think those are all the principles that should guide us as we make our way towards establishing a new framework here.
I think one of the other things that the hemp-derived cannabinoids does too is it makes it an acceptable, non-stigmatized entry point for the non-consuming, cannabis-consuming public. And so if they walk into the Total Wine and they see this and they buy one and it's like, oh, this is, I like this, right? It can change the perception, of those hardened opponents to the industry. And, we do get back to I sort of, compared to the old legacy landline versus, cell phone technology. And, right, someone has come up with a better mousetrap. Should they be, and stuck in the, old regulatory framework that existed, isn't sort of that what capitalism is all about. It's just the sort of the view from the hemp-derived cannabinoid side, but then you have the existing fully licensed operators who spent all this money both on the licensing process and an infrastructure, saying, hey, wait a second, you're letting them sell the exact same ingredient as we do without bearing the same costs as we do. It's unfair. And so it's a conversation that's going on for a while. Until, as Hirsch said, it's all under one, regulatory scheme.
Excellent. Okay. And Matthew, if you could hear this, I think Tom's been waiting for a little bit. If we can add him in, please. Moving on, and I think on a couple of points that you guys made. So what does this mean for repealing, 280E? And I know, I'm really excited to have Mike here on this because as Armanino is such a big firm, they've got a really good understanding of this with some things that they've been doing research on. So I'd love to hear from you, Mike.
Well, of course, eliminating 280E, reduces their tax liability, immediately. And what's going to be the issue here is really timing. I don't think that even under the best circumstances, if this gets finalized in September, October, whatever, before the election, or even right after the election, I don't think the effective date would be any sooner than January 1 of 2025, only because you really don't want to go through a period of having short period returns where you would have 280E in effect through, let's say, October 1, and then no 280E after October 1 through the end of the year. It just wouldn't really make a lot of sense. I also don't think that the IRS would ever go back and retroactively allow companies to go back and file, amended returns and claiming that now 280E is no longer enforced, that there would be like some sort of retroactive effect, unless, of course, the actions of TrueLeave are revealed and we find out, hey, there is some magic sauce, as they claim, to allow you to go back and file retroactive claims for 280E deductions.
Mike, have you heard any chatter about, a federal excise tax to make up for any revenue shortfalls?
Yeah, I mean,
way back one of the original bills.
Yeah, Senator Schumer, back, I wanted to say last year, maybe, proposed a federal excise tax in lieu of 280E. And I think that tax was pretty aggressive. I want to say it was like 25% or something. So I don't know if, I didn't really run the numbers on a fake company to see if they would be better off with 280E or a flat 25% excise tax. But off the top of my head, I think a 25% excise tax is worse than 280E. Because the other thing that a flat tax like that does, it takes away all negotiations of any sort of interpretation of 280E at that point. Because if it's a flat 25% of gross, well, then the number's the number. I mean, you can't argue that, well, something is in COGS, it's not in COGS, if it's a flat tax that you're, up against.
And let me just jump in really quick. I want to introduce Tom Zuber. Thank you so much for joining, Tom. In Tom's defense, Zoom's had some, for those of you who Zoom regularly, you might be finding that it's a little bit more buggy. And while the link let some of us in, we were having some challenges with some of the links, the same link for some others. And so definitely not Tom's fault. Tom, thank you so much for joining. If you'd like to introduce yourself really quick, that'd be great. We're really appreciative of having you here.
Chris, thanks. It's great to see friends here on the panel. Tom Zuber, I'm the managing partner of Zuber Lawler, and we've done a lot of cannabis work going back to 2006 across the country and around the world, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome, thank you. For those of you who aren't familiar, Zuber Lawler, I believe you guys have offices in 7 states now, something like that, 6 states.
Yeah, we're in 7 cities right now, and we do a lot of international work as well. So we're 2 largest offices are in Los Angeles, where I sit, and in New York City.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining. Just to double back on a point that Mike was making that I think, maybe you and others might be able to join on in a little bit bigger way. So if we see, let me rephrase that. We are seeing major alcohol movement into cannabis. Big alcohol is coming in a very big way, which, there's certain things I did expect. I did not expect to see alcohol coming in before we even saw the DEA announcing the rescheduling. So they've been moving into this over the past year. And I think now they're going to come into it in a much more aggressive way, knowing this is coming. They've all been hungry for it, I know, because I've got some contacts that I've talked to inside some of those companies. And so I have a question for the group it's a little bit off of the tax issue. So one of the things I've been wondering lately is, big alcohol has so much more lobbying power than the cannabis industry. And they have so much deeper ties and connections. Will they, if they're coming into this and they're saying, hey, look, this is revenue generation, this is a profit market for us, do you think that they will have sway to help influence some of those tax structures so that it's maybe saying 25%, what are you talking about? That's absolutely insane. And alcohol, we're looking at this, it's much lower, and try to help push and shape that with a much stronger force than we have. What's the group's thoughts?
I think that's an interesting notion there, and I think that there's something to it. I think one of the major changes that happens with this rescheduling is that now we've got a full throttle national medicinal cannabis conversation, and I think the implications of that reverberate throughout the recreational market as well. That starts, I think, with just a lot more people focused on this subject matter, including the whole lobbying mechanism of the tobacco and alcohol industry. They're now focused on this in a way that they haven't been before. Same thing with the pharmaceutical industry. I do think that what you're talking about is going to play out to some extent. You're going to have a lot more grownups in the room that are going to be pushing, sometimes in different directions, but in this instance, I think perhaps in the same direction, which is these taxes are absurd. So, Mike, I'd certainly like to hear what Mike has to say on that topic as the expert among the group here. Hi, Mike.
Well, I think that one of the things that I would say is that the alcohol industry has been losing market share in terms of like beer sales and other forms of alcohol. And so, of course, they have a huge incentive to get into this market. They have the bonded warehouses. They have the infrastructure for distribution. So, they certainly, can, take advantage of this, and having a strong lobbying group will certainly help. I think that one of the problems is going to be, how are we going to be able to have a system in place where, big alcohol doesn't like overtake the industry and cherry pick, certain brands that they will, collaborate with, have joint ventures with, acquire, whatever. And will we be in a situation where the little guy is going to get left out if they are not a big player in their home region?
I think that's inevitable.
Yeah. And what I see them, playing back on what Hirsch said earlier, but the infused beverage market, is likely to be one of the fastest growing form factors in this industry. The ability for them to now already sell, quote, low dose THC infused beverages, in my mind, leads them to lobby to keep that as a unregulated or lightly regulated industry, and therefore be able to quickly enter the market without having to apply for a license, or be able to manufacture them in a single processing facility, ship across the country. I could easily see them stepping in, sooner rather than later, and buying up some of the better known infused beverage brands and just pushing them across the country, through their own distribution channels and through I mean, my understanding is, at least one of the large, alcohol beverage distribution companies, is already carrying infused beverages.
Yeah. I know multiple distribution companies carrying, beverages. So you're right, Michael. It's absolutely happening. Hirsch, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I would just echo all that, and I would say it's very interesting to look at the number of brewers in a state like Minnesota that are now manufacturing or selling hemp beverages, and the way in which hemp beverages have been a lifeline for many of these struggling breweries. I think it's something like 15 to 20% of the craft breweries in Minnesota are engaging with hemp beverages in some fashion. And I think that sort of portends what we are likely to see across the country going forward. And your question was about lobbying. I think there has long been a suspicion that the alcohol industry might use its lobbying might to kind of clamp down on cannabis. Obviously, I'm not intimately familiar with those in the alcohol sector, but I think it's far more likely that they can't beat them, and so they instead choose to join them and see this as a critical revenue stream to mitigate declining revenues when there's reduced consumer interest in their traditional offerings. So I think it will be helpful to have entities of that size on our side.
Let's not forget about Constellation. Got into this years ago when they made their investment in Tilray, and so I think they've been standing in the sidelines here, and just as Hirsch was mentioning, I think that they can't beat them. They realize that they're going to be only so many dollars that each consumer has to spend on alcohol versus cannabis. And this is a great way for them to maybe regain that market share that they've been losing to cannabis over the years. And millennials, there are all these studies showing that millennials and Gen Z prefer cannabis versus alcohol anyway. So great opportunity for them to get to that younger generation.
One of the things, Chris, I think that's going to happen as a function of all these big players focusing their eyes now in a more energetic way on the cannabis industry is I think we're going to see a massive shift in emphasis on a national conversation, right? What we have now is we have the potential and I think the likelihood of sometime very soon of having a national medicinal cannabis conversation. So what that's going to do to the recreational market, I think, is material. And so as an example of that, you're going to have companies like major alcohol companies that have distribution networks that have achieved an infrastructure and economies of scale that are not even fathomable right now to a cannabis company. Furthermore, if you have a national medicinal cannabis conversation, then the notion of growing flower, for instance, in California or New York, all of a sudden for manufacturing purposes doesn't make much sense at all, right? So you're going to have national medicinal cannabis companies and other companies with that cannabis production capacity. They're going to be transferring medicinal cannabis from a place like the Midwest or even from outside the country, and they're now going to be moving that over time into other states on the borders, on the East Coast and on the West Coast, and that's just going to change the ballgame entirely because the manufacturing cost available in that national medicinal context is going to be obviously it's going to be powerful. As another example, if insurance starts to cover some of this stuff over time. And this is going to roll out, obviously, over a year, 2, 3 years. None of this is going to happen immediately. But insurance at some point is going to have a say in what's going on here. So if you can walk into a CVS, but not even a CVS, a dispensary, and you can get your national medicinal cannabis covered by insurance, what does that do to somebody who's got to go out of pocket for a recreational product in the recreational dispensary next door? So the impact of this, I think, hasn't really been really contemplated fully yet, and it's going to be very exciting. And I think the challenge, it's going to be very challenging, but the challenge is the opportunity. I think the companies that really embrace this change and really try and stay a step or two ahead of it are really have the potential here to take advantage of a board that's going to be completely upended from the bottom up.
I think those are really great points. Thank you, Tom. And to speak on a point that you made in particular, and that Mike was speaking to as well, I've been told by somebody who would know that Southern Glacier does something like 30 to 40 billion a year in revenue, maybe a little bit north of that. And then you've got UNFI, which is another major, health and wellness foods, not alcohol, but just kind of a relative type of industry that might also get in distribution. And they're in kind of that same revenue range. And if you look, I know the biggest distributor in alcohol is less than 1/100th of that size, if not maybe 1,000th of that size, and more state specific. And so you say they're so small compared to these big distributors in the warehousing, the infrastructure, the transportation metrics, the economies of scale, the things that these companies enjoy at the size that they're at. The cannabis companies can't compete. You're right. It's a very different game.
Sure.
Okay, I know we're pushing up on the hour here. We had just one more point to discuss really quickly, and then we're going to open up for some questions. And Tom, if you got something, if you want to lead on this one. So the last point here today is, what will this do for banking, capital markets, and new investment? I think we touched on a little bit of this, but would love to hear everybody's thoughts.
Sure, I'm happy to start off then, Chris. It's obviously going to be very exciting here because there's a large portion of the stigma has gone away, even now, before it's actually affected, whether it's in January 2025 or some other time. The stigma already has substantially gone away, and that'll continue to happen up until the point that the law is affected. So that means more money is going to move in, and that's a great thing. I think the biggest thing now is that you have the capacity now to look at an industry that previously the whole industry existed in this gray, right? So you had cannabis that was illegal at the federal level, legal at the state level, and that's just not good enough for most of the money out there, right? They weren't willing to touch cannabis as long as it was in this gray area. We now have a pure black and white legality as far as the national medicinal cannabis conversation. So I think the amount of money now that is going to look at cannabis and make that part of their day is going to be huge. The JP Morgans, the Goldman Sachs, and all of those folks, I think that they're going to look at it too. So the impact, I think, can't be overestimated. Even though we're going to have a complicated conversation between recreational and medicinal markets, I still think even recreational companies are going to benefit from this inflow of cash and this inflow of focus from these very large institutional investors that have been on the sidelines during that era of gray that's preceded today.
Great. Thank you. Harsh, Mike?
I don't have too much to add. I agree with what Tom said, and I would just reiterate what earlier in the discussion we were talking about, how these are largely discretionary decisions, right, by banks, by insurance companies, by stock exchanges about whether to serve cannabis businesses. And I think just the normative power of this rescheduling will change some of those discretionary decisions amongst legal departments at those various institutions, and that in turn will make the entire ecosystem healthier.
Yeah, I would just say that, the capital markets now are looking at, the Fed rate staying fairly stable, here for the next several months. And, the rate cuts that they were expecting doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon. And so they're always looking for what's the next big thing. And cannabis companies have been, their stock prices are down, maybe 90% of their all-time highs. And so it may be a great opportunity here where you've got almost the perfect storm of, the capital markets are hungry and looking for investments. Cannabis companies have been, plagued with negative news for a long time. And now with the onslaught of medical legalization, that could help spur significant capital coming into the industry.
I think it's very well said. Michael, I don't know if you have anything to add. I know we lost you for a
second. Yeah, the Zoom gremlins grabbed my computer away from me for a second. What was the question?
How do you see that this might affect banking, capital markets, and potential new investment?
Yeah, I mean, I've had this conversation with both some of these folks at the exchanges as well as the investor groups that are not yet in the industry, and they're taking a sort of wait and see approach. It obviously, it tips the balance slightly more in favor at looking at the sector. But I think, all those sort of business models, I think most folks who are not yet in the industry are going to sort of take a wait and see approach and see how it all plays out, and which of the business models under the new paradigm are the most likely to succeed, rather than just saying, okay, now it's time to write a check. Where should we invest? So I think it'll help, but I think it'll take. We're gonna have to see how the rule is implemented before anybody makes any drastic moves.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I apparently Mike Gorell and I not only share the same shirt, but we share the same view on this point. And the way I look at it is, really just from a capitalist perspective. You look globally and you see markets are down for the most part. There hasn't been a lot of attractive sectors in Canada or in the U.S. AI is trending, but other than that, a lot of tech is down. Anybody that's paying attention to the public markets, Tesla's not having a great time right now, but there's a lot of scrutiny, and so investors are looking for places to place capital. They have to deploy it. They have to make sure they're getting a return. Cannabis investments from the public sector are very attractive in terms of PE, especially when you look at relative comparables like alcohol, tobacco, other vice industries. And so I agree. I think we're going to see, for those of you wondering, I personally am very bullish and think that we're going to see a slow increase, but I think by the end of this year and moving into 2025, I think we're going to see cannabis become a growth industry in a very different way than we saw in 2019 and 2020, where it was an emerging market. I think now for the first time, we have stabilized businesses that are actually generating stable EBITDA measures. They understand what it means to have a large cultivation and have that stabilized, as opposed to just a guess. Same thing with manufacturing. Same thing with substantive brands, retailers that have multiple locations. And so we're in a much more mature industry. I'm not going to say it's a mature industry in general, but it's much more mature than it was, with stabilized businesses for the first time that know how to weather real challenging environments, economic environments, or competitive environments. And so I think that's going to be. I think all of those factors together make a much more attractive industry for investors to come in. And the last thing I would note is that one thing that I think is very different is that in the 2017, 18, 19, 20 period, we saw people come in with like $1 million, a couple $1 million, some 10 million, 8 figures or more, and then a few that came in with 9 figures. But if BlackRock decided to come in and put 10 billion into this, we're talking about such a different deployment of capital that we could see from some of these big groups. It's such a different thing that I think it shifts the needle in an interesting way. Well, let's do this. I know we're a little bit over time. I know we need to go in a second. For those that in the audience that can stay for a few minutes, and for those on the panel that might have a few minutes to stay, we've got a few questions. Let me just read from some of these questions. Before I jump into that, I want to say thank you everyone for your time today. Thank you to our panelists for appreciate you hanging in there even with some of the technical issues we had. But really great to have you here. And we really appreciate the audience and their time over this issue that I think is so hot on everybody's mind right now. So for those that do have a couple minutes to stay in both the panel and in the audience, let's jump into a couple questions real quickly here. So just looking through some of the questions. Tom, you made a point about insurance, and there was a question about, if there is an FDA pathway to Schedule 3, does the insurance reimbursement or the insurance paying make the pathway for products into pharmacies more affordable and more likely, do you think?
Does the insurance, say that one more time, please, Chris?
Yeah. If we see, so you touched on, I think, a very good point, and that is that, like, okay, if we see this become federally legal, does that create, or does that put insurance companies in a position where they're enforced to offer cannabis as a medicine? And so the question is, does that, not in the immediate future, but maybe in the next couple of years, does that potentially lead into cannabis making its way into pharmacies as a more normalized products? product?
I think potentially over the long term, I think the answer is absolutely yes, but we have to keep in mind that we don't yet know how the FDA is going to approach this subject matter with any appreciable detail, right? And so that's a big, huge question mark here. So I think the FDA first is going to have to approve some products, and then I think we're going to see the wheels of insurance turn on top of that. But I think the key player there is the FDA and how they're going to react to this and how aggressively they're going to wade through this subject matter, right?
Hey, Matt, thank you for your question. Moving on, Kenneth had a question for the panel. Assuming rescheduling to Schedule 3, what is your view on the retroactive application? And forgive me, actually, I'm not sure if I thought I understood that a little better, and I'm not sure I do, so I'm going to skip that one for now. Research. What does this mean for research after it's rescheduled? Are we likely to see, of course, more open doors for research, but do you think we'll see more money coming into research around cannabis products? And that's from Gaetano.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. I mean, I know New Jersey, actually independent of rescheduling, has finally released its rules for research, and so I think I think it makes it easier. And I think we will see more money, flowing into the research space.
I agree with Michael there, and I think furthermore, it's one of the most exciting components of this rescheduling conversation is the fact that we're now, I think, going to have a serious conversation about cannabis actually being medicine, which it is, right? There's been this ridiculous, absurd phenomenon in the context of which there's been a refusal to look at cannabis as medicine, and in the meantime, you've got, I think, potentially some other pain relief products that haven't been so productive and in fact have been counterproductive in some instances. And so when I think as we talk about rescheduling, we're going to have a lot more doctors and hospitals and research institutions that are going to start taking this seriously and are going to start seeing the effects that cannabis has potentially on cancer. I mean, there are some dramatic signs here that the potential of cannabis to alleviate the human condition, physiological condition, is profound beyond anything that we've contemplated, in the past. So as we do this, I think we're going to discover some enormous benefits of cannabis in hospitals in a true blue medicinal context. And I think it's going to be exciting and potentially mind blowing. And I'm very excited for it personally.
Yeah, for whatever it's worth, I very much so agree. I think the one aspect of the industry that we haven't seen really fully developed that I think hasn't even been touched, to Tom's point, is this whole health, wellness, supplement medicine, basically things in kind of more of this health oriented category. And I think that there's so many anecdotal things we've seen from what Tom was noting in terms of, and I've seen this in a number of patients that I've had or customers I've had in my own businesses where they've successfully treated cancer or some other ailment. And it's certainly not something I would recommend trying just with that, but when they supplement with chemo or whatever, they've had profound results. There's interesting early research. And I think from more aggressive medicine to a number of health benefits from different cannabinoid products, I think that is, personally, I think that's going to be the biggest upcoming sector of the industry that we see in the future. Mike, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to.
No, but there's, I think, over 100 different compounds in the cannabinoid plant, and so it's going to take a long time to go through and figure out which one of those combinations and how it affects the body and how it benefits the body. So I think it'll take a long time to figure out all the benefits that this plant has, and hopefully they'll find a way to have everyone lose weight, and it'll be like an alternative to Ozempic and all the other weight loss drugs, and that'll get the pharma companies really excited.
Yeah. Okay. Well, want to thank the panel again. Thank you so much, Tom, Mike, and Mike. Rachel wasn't able to join us today. She had a personal thing come up and she wasn't able to join. Hirsch, thank you so much for your time. Thank you to the audience. I don't know if there was any last things that you gentlemen wanted to note before we jump off, or.
Looking forward to seeing what the rules actually say and hopefully getting this done, before the election.
Tom, did you have
Chris, great to be here. It's good to see everyone, and it's a very exciting conversation. There are a lot of challenges here, but a lot of opportunities on the other side of those challenges, and it's a very exciting time. So really, just very excited to see what happens.
So that, Mike, did you have any?
I've been in this business since 2015, and it's unfortunate that we had COVID come in there and kind of like slow things down, because I thought we had a lot of momentum going into COVID, but now it looks like we've got that momentum coming back again, and it's really an exciting time to be in this industry.
Awesome. All right, thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate you, and we look forward to seeing our audience at our next virtual event next month. Thank you, everyone.